This program is about nonprofit CCRC executive compensation. Compensation is an area of sensitivity and often of controversy. It's easy to criticize, but people deserve to receive a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. It's important in going through this material to keep an open mind that performance may be deserving of rich compensation. An entrepreneur who builds a business is often richly rewarded for that effort, and appropriately so if the entrepreneur's effort has the benefit of improving human existence. So before we decide that a given income is too high or inappropriate, it's important to keep an open mind about the value that the executive brings to the process. There are a few thoughts to ponder before we begin. First, a charity that puts mission first will attract leaders who put service before material rewards. Many nonprofits are similar to businesses, except that they don't pay taxes. They may sell a product more than they act as charities. One example is Kaiser Permanente, which provides healthcare services, and most continuing care retirement communities are public benefit corporations or similarly organized under the nonprofit rules, and therefore are nonprofits which operate as much as businesses, setting a price for their product, requesting entrance fees, and requiring monthly fees and other fees for service, than they are charities providing care to the needy. Since nonprofit businesses sell a service, their revenues are more like those of an investor-owned business. Such nonprofit businesses are able to pay market competitive executive compensation. People are often shocked at compensation packages that are far above what the average worker earns. The contrary argument is that talent is scarce and it is important to pay a sufficient income to attract and retain qualified executives. The compensation paid to an executive needs to be compared with the value of what the executive brings to the business. The maximum that any job is worth logically is only reached when the cost to fill the job with a competent incumbent is so high that it is better not to fill the position or to dissolve the business rather than to pay the excessive required compensation. That's a very high maximum standard. I've never seen that limit reached. Hence, the maximum justifiable compensation is a matter of business judgment, and it is fair to evaluate the business judgment displayed by an enterprise in terms of how it compensates its executives. If the pay seems extraordinarily high, it's possible that the business has become focused on providing compensation to its executives more on the completion of its mission. For a CCRC, this may mean that more of the executives' efforts and their attention in their interactions with their board and other observers is focused on justifying their compensation as much as it is on providing a quality of life for the residents in their care. There are constraints on high executive pay resulting from the tax-exempt status of nonprofit enterprises. The Internal Revenue Service requires that the nonprofit purpose be charitable, which is loosely defined, that's a subject for another program, and that it not benefit particularly any private person in excess of what is appropriate. The Internal Revenue Service has severe penalties on excess compensation, which the IRS likes to call excess benefit transactions. These penalties are contained in Internal Revenue Code section 4958. The penalties in section 4958 include an excise tax equal to 25% of the excess benefit, which is imposed on the executive who received the compensation. An additional 200% excess tax is required if the excess amounts of compensation received are not repaid within a period technically called cure for abatement. Generally it's set at 90 days, though the Internal Revenue Service can extend the period during which the executive is able to meet the requirements and repay the excess amount. In addition, there is a 10% excess tax on those organizational managers who knowingly participate in the transaction. This, of course, puts a tremendous burden on people establishing executive compensation for the officers of a nonprofit organization, and that led to some concerns. In response to those concerns, the Internal Revenue Service developed standards that provide a safe harbor for executive compensation. This means that the compensation will be considered to be appropriate if it is determined according to a process which has been defined by the Internal Revenue Service in its regulations and in a talk given by Steve Miller, who was the director of the Exempt Organizations Division of the Internal Revenue Service. There are 4 requirements for the Internal Revenue Service's safe harbor. First, the compensation must be determined in advance by an authorized body. Usually that authorized body is a committee of the board. Generally it's outside directors of the board, and that authorized body, in other words the committee of the board, must have no conflict of interest in the transaction. We'll just talk about the board here because I think in the way most people think of executive compensation, they see it as established by the board. The compensation must be consistent with that paid for similar services by comparable organizations. This means that the committee of the board that is setting the compensation must have a way to be able to determine what comparable organizations are paying. Also, the study of comparability must be made by an unbiased neutral observer. Generally, this test has been met by retaining outside compensation consultants who conduct periodic studies of what is considered to be comparable compensation for comparable work in comparable organizations. The comparability question, for example, for a nonprofit, would be whether the comparability should only be with other nonprofits in the senior housing industry, for example, or whether it should be with organizations generally. Sometimes it's felt that the standard should be a wider standard, since a capable executive might be able to find a position or an attractive offer outside the industry, and therefore retention would require that a competitive salary be paid to keep that executive working within the CCRC and senior housing industry. In addition, the board committee's proceeding must be fully documented before the next meeting of the board or within 60 days if sooner. Again, this is an area in which executive compensation consultants help the board with these compliance tasks. Many nonprofits now engage professional compensation consultants, and many more are engaging them since the enactment of Internal Revenue Code 4958 with its stringent penalties. Compensation consultants are expert in bonus and similar incentive programs, and the consensus or the operating idea of the consulting enterprise is that executive bonuses and incentives for performance can motivate executives to more effective activity than would otherwise be the case. It's not clear, however, if such compensation incentives change executive behavior, or if the executives would have been equally engaged with the organizational mission as a matter of conscience and commitment. In fact, some people argue that the existence of these bonus incentives encourages executives to focus on maximizing their compensation more than on doing what is best for the long-term realization of the organizational mission. This is something which the board of directors is charged to weigh and to determine what is best for a particular organization. Let's take a specific example to illustrate how this may have impacted executive compensation in the CCRC arena. The numbers in this example are for an existing CCRC senior housing enterprise. It's left unnamed so that we can focus here on the generality of understanding how nonprofit compensation in this industry functions in practice. The size of the enterprise over the term of the study that we're going to be looking at has been largely unchanged in terms of number of residents. There have been some housing ventures unrelated to the core mission which have had mixed success. That means that some appear to be succeeding and some have failed. So it's not clear that that added complexity has been managed with the efficacy that the incentive programs might be expected to motivate. During the period, resident contracts were changed to be more favorable to the enterprise and less favorable to the resident. Moreover, monthly fees were reset at the time of the contract changes so that newer residents pay higher fees and receive less advantageous contracts, with established residents paying lower fees for greater benefits. The effect of that, of course, is that as new residents supplant the established residents, the margins, the profit margins in the business will become greater. There'll be more money for things other than service to residents, since the new contracts are less advantageous, and that of course frees up money which can be used to improve executive compensation. That's not to say that that improved executive compensation is inappropriate. That's a judgment matter for the board of directors and other observers to make. It may well be, for example, that the incomes before were sub-market and were inappropriately low, and that the additional margins in these less advantageous contracts for a higher price have simply allowed the executives to have fair compensation. It's true that part of the change was to change to what is known in the CCRC industry as a Type C contract, and since it is difficult for prospective residents to compare the value of the various contract types offered by CCRCs, the change to a Type C contract can allow the sale of residences at a higher margin price than what might be possible in an environment in which the competitive picture was fully understood by the prospective residents. Here we see what this particular CEO received in 990, Form 990 reportable benefits. There are some caveats to be used in connection with this. First, the non-990 reportable basis. I should quickly add that Form 990 is an annual reporting form required of nonprofit organizations by the Internal Revenue Service to justify their continuing exemption from taxation. The 990 reportable basis is not always what people might expect. There may be deferred income impacts. For example, the executive may have deferred income in a prior period and be receiving it in a current period. Compensation may also not reflect geographic cost of living differences. And the example may simply show the increased profitability resulting from the contract. Or it may reflect the impact of the recommendations from the outside compensation consultants about what is needed to attract and retain competent executives. It may be that the executive in question would have been unwilling to continue in office for less compensation, or that motivation was needed to improve the executive's performance. These are all caveats to have in mind when reviewing these data. Still, what we see in the graph in front of us here is that the executive, who's incidentally, I should say that this executive was CEO throughout this period. As previously noted, the organization has really changed very little in its complexion over this period, and his compensation increased from roughly $163,000 in 1997 to over $1,400,000 in 2009, the latest year which we have available. The black line shows the trend line if we were to use regression analysis to illustrate how the compensation is increasing. The red line is intended to show how residents' ability to pay fees may have been impacted over this period, since that shows what the executive's compensation would have been if the 1997 $163,107 income had been increased over the period solely by the cost of living adjustment factors which have been applied to Social Security incomes over the same period. So it's clear here that the growing margins of the business have allowed the executive to have higher compensation, and since the contract changes combined with the higher fees for new residents were introduced in the 2006 period, it's evident that those margins seem to be allowing the organization to pay the executive more handsomely than was the case before then. Well, how have changing compensation concepts affected all of this? The Internal Revenue Code 4958 was introduced in the late 1990s, and the Safe Harbor provision was first announced in 2001. So it's clear that compensation has been impacted over the most recent 10 years. Tying executive compensation to competitive studies can lead to an upward spiral in a race to match the pay at comparable organizations. If the top organizations pay a high income and the executives now see in the studies that they're being underfunded, they may put pressure on the board to increase their pay to be comparable to that paid by other like situation organizations. This may have had an upward pressure on executive compensation in those nonprofit organizations that have had the profit margins to be able to pay executive compensation at higher levels. Compensation consultants can have a conflict of interest, and this has led at least one major firm, Hewitt Associates, to leave the business. To understand this conflict of interest, we note what Charles Tharp, who is Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center on Executive Compensation of the Human Resources Policy Association in Washington, he said, "The concern is that the board consultant will provide advice designed to reinforce management's recommendations on pay in order to ensure that the consultant's firm retains the other consulting business, which can often be more lucrative." On a more specific level, Russ Fraden, who was the Hewitt chairman and CEO, when he announced that his firm was leaving the executive compensation consulting business, commented, "The independence of executive compensation consultants who serve compensation committees has become a politically charged issue over the past few years. While Hewitt has established substantial safeguards to ensure that our consultants provide purely objective advice and counsel, the recent Securities and Exchange Commission fee disclosure rules and political environment are pressuring some clients to avoid the issue entirely by moving to completely independent advisors." Well, what can we conclude from all this? First, for-profit enterprises have different rules since investors are expected to constrain excess. For-profit organizations have investor oversight. Nonprofit organizations lack a similar accountability standard, since donors are expected to give their donation freely and seldom exercise the kind of oversight that investors exercise over a for-profit business. Struggling charities have an inherent funding limit that constrains compensation to minimal levels. Executives in these enterprises have to serve as a service of love and devotion to the mission of the organization, since the funding is rarely there to enable executives to be compensated consistent with levels in the for-profit sector, and sacrifice is really required to support the mission. But this is different for nonprofit businesses like healthcare enterprises, hospitals, universities, and CCRCs, which are subject only to board restraint. Fortunately, most boards exercise restraint and keep compensation to the minimum level that's needed to attract qualified executives without overpaying them. Some few boards, though, elevate executives more for loyal service than for competence, and sometimes they reward them far more richly than would be commensurate with the results that the executives achieve. Compensation is one of the primary purposes of board oversight, and the compensation, support, and selection of the Chief Executive Officer is a major concern for boards of directors.